We are back on Morning Line. Thanks for joining us, talking about the questions of sanity, insanity, some high-profile cases we've had of late, and one still pending. Individuals in charge of determining that play a big role in these types of cases. Dr. Kimberly Brown is joining us, forensic psychologist from Vanderbilt, handles a lot of these cases here in Davidson County. And we need to be clear on this, too, Dr. Brown. I mean, the decision on sanity, or on competency anyway, it's not made by the judge without reference to you. It's not made by the prosecution or the defense. You guys really make that call, don't you? I mean, I can tell you right now, prosecutors in a lot of these cases are chomping at the bit, ready to try some of these individuals. And they're like, what? Still not competent? I mean, they want it to happen, but they have to wait until they get word from the doctors, correct?
Well, we offer our opinions and recommendations to the court. It is the judge or the jury who ultimately decides whether the person is insane at the time of the crime, and the judge is the one who ultimately decides whether somebody is competent or not. But having said that, I do appreciate that experts' opinions and reports hold significant weight, and most of the time, especially with competency, the judge is going to side with the evaluator. And if we say that they're not competent, find that the person is incompetent. But ultimately, that decision does rest with the judge for competency and judge or jury for the insanity defense.
Well, yeah, once it goes to trial. I guess my point is before it gets to trial, and you're right, they can do whatever they want, but you know as well as I do, if it's a consensus that they're not competent and they send them to trial, that's going to be the very first thing, if they're convicted, the defense is going to bring up on appeal. So the judge doesn't want to deal with that,
Sure.
And neither does the prosecution.
That's absolutely true, right? Nobody wants to try someone who is actually incompetent to stand trial. Number one, it's unconstitutional. Number two, as you said, if it does go forward, then it would be grounds for appeal. There are times, though, that there are competency hearings in which somebody's competency is contested. And there may be different experts' opinions. One side thinks they're competent, one side thinks they're not. Or there may just be one expert involved, but one side doesn't agree with their opinion. So competency hearings are a thing, and they do happen. So sometimes these issues are contested.
Okay, you did a great job at the beginning of the show clarifying the difference between competency and insanity, and the idea of insanity being what your state of mind was at the time the alleged crime occurred. And so let's talk then about insanity, and maybe give the definition of insanity, if you would, for folks. What is that?
Sure. So it's going to vary state by state. Some states don't have an insanity defense at all. So unlike competency, which is a constitutional right, insanity is not. It is constitutional for some states to not have an insanity defense at all. Tennessee does. And the definition of Tennessee is that because of a severe mental disease or defect at the time of the alleged offense, the person was unable to appreciate the nature or the wrongfulness of their actions. And I will tell you that most of the time for these cases, the issue is wrongfulness rather than nature. It's rare for someone to not appreciate the nature of their actions. So if we're looking at someone who is mentally ill at the time of the crime, oftentimes these are individuals with symptoms of psychosis, like schizophrenia diagnosis, that are directly impacting their actions at the time of the crime. And I think this is really important to note. There are some people who are mentally ill at the time of the crime, but their symptoms do not directly relate to their criminal actions. In other words, they're just coexisting at the same time. So if I have schizophrenia and I'm walking down Broadway and I reach over and steal your wallet from you because I'm hungry and I want food, or I want alcohol, that my symptoms are probably not directly related to my criminal actions there, right? Mm-hmm. But if I'm walking down Broadway and I think you're the person who has put the microchip in my brain that's monitoring my thoughts, and I've got to get you to stop it, then my symptoms are probably directly related to my criminal actions, right? So they have to be directly related. Not only do they have to be directly related, but then they have to also cause me to not appreciate the nature or the wrongfulness of my actions, to not appreciate that what I was doing was wrong. So you could see that this analysis, this multi-layered analysis, really is very restrictive and only captures a very small number of people.
Yeah, it's very interesting to consider. When I think about the Travis Reinking case, or just in a case in general, as you just used an example, if there's a voice in your head telling you to do something, And that's what we heard testified to with Travis Reinking. All right, so his illness is maybe causing him to hear voices, but then the problem is, after he did what he did, he ran from the scene. So, okay, I'm like, all right, I understand he's hearing voices, he's mentally ill, but then if he ran from the scene, that tells me that he knew what he did was wrong, as opposed to had he just shot up the Waffle House and then sat down and ordered a waffle, I'd say, well, now that shows he had no clue what he did was wrong, but he took off. And I wonder if that's something that jurors sometimes have to struggle with. Can there be an explanation for, well, he ran off, so he may have heard voices, but he knew what the voices were telling him to do were wrong, and he still did it, and then he took off?
I think running from the scene is tricky, and I think anytime you focus on one piece of information and interpret it as only meaning one thing, it's dangerous, right?
Yeah.
So you have to look at all this information in context. So running from the scene could mean different things. I agree with you that running from the scene could mean that someone didn't appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions. I also have had cases in which people are very paranoid, they're very psychotic, and they believe that the people they're running from, including the police, the government, are part of the people who are persecuting them and trying to harm them. So their running away from them is consistent with them trying to protect themselves. So I would just caution about taking any one piece of information in isolation and interpreting that as meaning, oh, they could appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions. It always has to be looked at in context with all those puzzle pieces out in front of you.
That's an excellent point. You're right, because maybe the paranoia was still there as it moved on from that point. All right, just with regard then to insanity and not insanity, in many of the cases you've dealt with, it just seems this day and age, I was going back and trying to find, it is very difficult. And can you remember, have you had many cases where an individual was deemed, I mean, just in general terms, not guilty by reason of insanity? It seems like these days, it's just, for better or for worse, that just doesn't happen very often. And I do believe people are truly insane out there, but with juries these days and the anger that's out there and the nature of the crimes, I just don't see juries coming back with not guilties for that, even in some cases where I frankly think sometimes someone truly is insane.
Yeah, fair. I have 3 responses to that. One, about 30 people across the state of Tennessee every year are found not guilty by reason of insanity. So of all the crimes that are committed in Tennessee, or all the defendants in Tennessee, about 30 of them actually are found not guilty by reason of insanity. But the second point I want to make is that most of the time these are stipulated. You don't hear about them because they don't go to trial. These are crimes in which the defense and the prosecution agree. This person is insane. We're going to stipulate to the insanity defense, and the defendant pleads not guilty by reason of insanity and is found not guilty by reason of insanity. There's never a trial. There's never a jury involved. Now,
but fair to say,
these big
fair to say, doctor, though, that those are not mass murder cases. Okay, I'm just saying, if it's I can't imagine that a single one of those 30 was someone that killed 1 or more people. Maybe there was, but I mean,
absolutely.
Okay, and that's the difference. That's what I'm talking about. The sentiment out there. Okay.
Yes, you are correct. So I absolutely agree with your point that if it's going to be a high-profile case in which, you know, there's just tragic loss of life, and it's going to go before a jury, juries are extremely reluctant to find anyone insane at the time of the crime. So I absolutely agree with your initial point there. It doesn't happen often that we go to a jury trial for an insanity defense, but it does tend to be these higher profile cases. And most of the time, juries will not find people insane, especially on a murder charge.
In those cases, sometimes where someone had been found not guilty by reason of insanity, and I'm thinking about the individual Chapman who shot Ronald Reagan, right? I mean, he served his time, and then eventually, people understand it's left to the evaluators and the doctors over time to determine whether or not someone, after they've served and had treatment, can then be released, correct?
It depends. So John Hinckley,
Hinckley, I'm sorry, not Champ, but Hinckley. Thank you. I apologize. I got that wrong. Go ahead.
That's okay. He was in St. Elizabeth's mental hospital for decades. So it's not like he had a short stint and then was released. In regards to your point, do the doctors make the decision about release? It depends. In many cases, there's what's called judicial review. where the doctors at the hospital where the person's being treated will make a recommendation to the court about whether they think the person is ready to be released. But ultimately, it is the court who decides whether they agree with the doctors or not. So in some cases, it is the doctor's decision, but in other cases, especially higher profile cases where people are found not guilty by reason of insanity, there is judicial review so that the courts always have to be the last one to sign off on that.
Interesting.
And by the way, when they're released, it's not like the doors open and they walk out and that's it. It's usually a very gradual process. They may have spent a furlough for a couple days every month in a group home, trying it out, testing it out. They have a lot of resources in place. They're being sent to a particular facility with a particular outpatient center. They have financial resources, disability. So it is a pretty protected system that they're usually being released to.
We've got to take a break, Doctor. We'll be back with one more segment with you and a couple of phone calls as well as our conversation continues right after this. Stay with us.